How Richard used silence to become mentally indestructible. Chapter 1. The Noise Inside. Richard's Overwhelming Inner World. Richard looked like he had it all together. To the world, he was functional. He held a decent job, kept up conversations, smiled at the right times. But inside it was chaos. There was a noise he couldn't turn off. It wasn't just sound, it was mental clutter, endless overthinking, second-guessing every choice he made, imagining arguments that never happened, replaying mistakes from years ago, predicting catastrophes that hadn't come and probably never would. He lived in his head more than he lived in the world. And in that head, there were no quiet corners. Every moment of stillness became a trigger for anxiety, so he filled every spare second with something. Podcasts during showers, music while eating, YouTube videos before bed, constant scroll, constant noise. He feared silence like others fear the dark, because in silence, the thoughts got louder. And worse, more honest. They said things he didn't want to face, that he wasn't really proud of who he was becoming, that he didn't know what he was chasing, that most of his productivity was just avoidance in disguise. But rather than confront those thoughts, Richard numbed them. He kept busy. He overcommit. He laughed at things that weren't funny and agreed to things he didn't believe in, because staying distracted felt safer than sitting with himself. But deep down, he knew it wasn't sustainable. There's only so long you can outrun your own mind. And though he wouldn't admit it yet, part of him wanted to stop running. Part of him wanted to know what it would feel like just once to be okay in stillness, to not be terrified of his own thoughts, to sit in silence and not be destroyed by it. He just didn't know how to begin. Chapter 2. Burnout and Breakdown. When he couldn't escape himself anymore. For a while, Richard believed distraction was a sustainable strategy, that if he kept his schedule full, his playlists loud, his conversations surface level, the inner storm would never reach him. He became a master of motion, constantly doing, constantly going, but never actually arriving anywhere. But the mind has limits, and so does the body. The signs started quietly: restless nights, shallow sleep, constant fatigue, headaches that no amount of caffeine could fix. His memory began slipping, appointments forgotten, names misplaced. But Richard brushed it off. To stress, he told himself. Everyone's tired these days. Then came the panic attacks. The first one hit on a Monday morning, sitting in traffic. A wave of heat surged through his chest. His heart raced uncontrollably. His hands trembled. He thought he was dying. He pulled over, gasping for air, shaking, certain this was the end. But it wasn't a heart attack. It was his mind, finally demanding to be heard. In the weeks that followed, it got worse. He couldn't concentrate. Noise overwhelmed him. Crowded places made him dizzy. His once manageable anxiety became paralyzing. He started calling in sick. Then he stopped answering texts. Slowly, his carefully maintained world began to crumble. One evening, alone in his apartment, Richard sat in front of a muted TV screen. He realized something terrifying. He wasn't avoiding pain anymore. He was becoming it. Every layer of distraction had peeled away, and there he was, face to face with himself. And he didn't like what he saw, not because he was broken, but because he had no idea who he really was underneath the noise. He broke down, not dramatically. There were no slammed doors, no shattered glass, just quiet tears in a room full of silence, a silence he had spent years avoiding. But within that breakdown, something unexpected happened. For the first time, Richard didn't reach for his phone. He didn't open YouTube or blast music or text someone to distract himself. He just sat there, breathing, shaking, crying, but present. And in that stillness, something cracked open. He didn't know it yet, but that moment, the one he thought marked his collapse, would be the start of something new, a different kind of strength, a different kind of life. It would all begin with silence. Chapter 3. The First Quiet Morning. Confronting silence without running. The next morning was different. Richard didn't wake up to the blaring sound of his alarm or the rush of anxiety pulling him from sleep. He just opened his eyes. It was quiet, not because the world had changed, but because for once he hadn't reached for anything to drown it out. No music, No notifications. No screen to scroll. Just breath, stillness, and a strange, fragile calm that felt almost alien to him. He sat on the edge of his bed, unsure what to do. Every instinct told him to grab his phone, to check messages, to plug back in. But he didn't. He stayed still for 5 minutes, then 10. And in that silence, something remarkable happened. He started noticing things he'd forgotten how to see. The golden light filtering through the curtain. The sound of birds outside. Not just noise, but a rhythm. The distant hum of a world waking up. More than anything, though, he noticed his thoughts. At first, they came rushing in, like a flood let loose. What are you doing? You're wasting time. You have so much to do. Get moving. Don't be lazy. Don't sit still. But this time, instead of reacting, Richard just watched. Like clouds passing in the sky, he let the thoughts come and go. And beneath the noise, he found something unfamiliar. A still, observing presence. A self that didn't need to be doing anything to be real. It was uncomfortable at first. The silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt raw. Because without distractions, there was nowhere to hide. But within that discomfort, there was also truth. He realized how often he had mistaken noise for meaning. How often he'd measured his value by activity, not presence. How rarely he had listened to others, to the world, to himself. That morning, Richard didn't have a breakthrough or a sudden enlightenment. But he did have something better, a beginning. For the first time, he experienced silence not as an enemy, but as a space. A space where he could hear himself think. A space where healing might be possible. And maybe, just maybe, a space where he could build something stronger than distraction. A relationship with himself. Chapter 4. Discovering the strength in stillness. When silence becomes a tool, not a threat. Over the next few weeks, Richard returned to silence like someone returns to a gym. Uncertain, shaky, but committed. At first, it was 5 minutes a day. Then 10. Eventually, entire mornings would pass without the compulsive urge to fill the space with sound or screens. But this wasn't passive silence. It was active, intentional, discomforting, revealing. It wasn't about zoning out. It was about zoning in. And in that quiet, something unexpected began to take root, clarity. For the first time in years, Richard started noticing how reactive his life had become. Every conversation, every opinion, every digital buzz had pulled him in different directions. He had spent years living in reaction mode, reacting to trends, expectations, demands, never truly acting from a grounded place of his own. In silence, he wasn't anyone's employee. He wasn't someone's friend, partner, or sibling. He was just a man sitting with his breath, his thoughts, his body. And that was enough. He realized something profound. Silence wasn't a weakness. It wasn't emptiness. It was space, and within that space was power. He became more observant. In meetings, he didn't rush to speak. He listened. In conversations, he didn't interrupt. He let pauses breathe. He learned to recognize emotional patterns, to feel the rise of anger or fear or defensiveness. And instead of reacting, he'd pause, breathe, reflect. And that changed everything. It gave him distance from a chaos. It gave him choices where before there were only impulses. And it gave him a sense of self-respect he'd never known. The world around him didn't get quieter, but he did. And in that stillness, he felt stronger. Not because life became easier, but because he finally had an anchor. Something solid inside. Something he could return to, no matter how loud the world became. Stillness, he discovered, wasn't the absence of power. It was power. Chapter 5. Rebuilding identity without the noise. Who am I when no one's watching? Silence, over time, became more than a daily practice for Richard. It became a mirror. And for the first time, he didn't look away. There's something unnerving about stripping away all the things that once defined you. No titles, no achievements, no validation from others. Just you, without performance, without pretense. At first, Richard didn't know what to do with that version of himself. Without the usual noise, the constant hustle, the proving, the pleasing, he felt exposed. But slowly, he started to see something else. Beneath all the roles he had performed for so long, the good son, the dependable friend, the overachiever. There was a person who had been waiting to speak. Someone thoughtful, someone curious, someone afraid, yes, but also resilient. Someone who didn't need to be impressive to be worthy of attention. The silence wasn't erasing his identity. It was revealing it. He began asking different questions. Not what should I do with my life? Or how do I get ahead? But what matters to me, really? What kind of person do I want to be when no one's watching? What does it mean to live on purpose? Not for applause, but for alignment. Without external noise to chase, Richard began noticing internal signals. The joy he felt when reading quietly. The depth of focus when writing without distraction. The energy that returned when he stopped trying to please everyone around him. The more he listened to his own inner voice, the less interested he became in the volume of the world's demands. He started saying no more, not out of rebellion, but out of clarity. He made time for solitude, not to escape others, but to connect with himself. He let go of relationships that only survived through performance, and in their place welcomed stillness. In a society obsessed with doing, Richard was learning to be. And it was in that being, that quiet, intentional presence, that his identity finally stopped wobbling. It wasn't built on trends, attention, or noise anymore. It was built on truth, on values, on self-respect, on quiet integrity. And once that foundation was laid, something remarkable started to happen. Richard no longer needed the world to tell him who he was. He knew. Chapter 6. The moment he was tested, and silence became his strength. Growth is easy to claim when things are calm. But real transformation? That gets tested in chaos. Richard's test came unexpectedly. A team meeting at work spiraled into tension. Deadlines had been missed. Blame was being tossed around like hot coals. And then someone pointed at him, publicly, unfairly, aggressively. Old Richard would have snapped. He would have defended himself instantly, raising his voice just enough to reclaim control. He would have made his case, talked over whoever tried to interrupt, and walked out with shaky hands and a wounded pride. But this time, something different happened. He felt the heat rise, the pulse quicken, the ego flare up, and he didn't fight it. He observed it. And then he paused. He stayed silent for a full breath. Not the kind of silence that screams passive aggression, but the kind that signals groundedness, like a mountain choosing not to respond to the storm. He looked the accuser in the eye, and with a calm, even tone, he said something measured, precise, firm, without being defensive. He didn't match the chaos. He didn't try to dominate the room. He simply held his presence, and the entire energy shifted. People listened. Tension softened, and Richard walked out not with adrenaline pumping, but with peace. It wasn't that he had won the moment. It was that he had stayed rooted in himself. He realized then what all those quiet mornings had been preparing him for. Not escape, but engagement. Not to become detached from life, but to respond to it differently. With depth, with control, with power that didn't shout. That moment became a milestone, because it proved something silence alone couldn't. That the real work wasn't just in meditation. It was in how you carried that stillness into the noise. Richard didn't just sit quietly anymore. He moved quietly. He spoke with clarity. He led from presence. And in that meeting, on that tense day, the man who had once been afraid of being invisible became someone impossible to ignore. Chapter 7. Redefining Power, the Rise of Inner Authority. Before his transformation, Richard thought power meant control. Control over outcomes, over people's opinions, over his own image. He believed power was something you showed, in your voice, your success, your presence in a room. Loud, certain, polished. But as he sat deeper in his silence and carried it with him into the world, that definition began to crumble. He started noticing a different kind of power. It wasn't flashy. It didn't demand attention. It didn't need to win. It simply was. It came from knowing who you are when no one's watching. From being so aligned with your values that you don't have to shout them. From having nothing to prove and still showing up with everything you are. This kind of power doesn't make people feel small. It makes them feel safe. It doesn't silence others to be heard. It listens first. It doesn't dominate the room. It anchors it. Richard realized something profound. True power is not found in your ability to control the world, but in your ability to remain undisturbed by it. And that kind of steadiness, it's magnetic. People around him noticed, not because he talked more, but because he talked less and said more. Not because he took over the spotlight, but because he didn't need it. He stopped chasing respect and started embodying it. He stopped reacting to chaos and started responding to life. And in that shift, he became a source of gravity, not noise. This rise in inner authority didn't make him more passive. It made him clearer, more decisive, more intentional. He understood now. Real power isn't something you get from the world. It's something you return to once the noise fades and the silence becomes home. And once you taste that kind of power, you never need to shout again. Chapter 8. A New Way of Living. The quiet confidence that changed everything. By now, Richard wasn't trying to fix himself anymore. He wasn't looking for the next productivity hack, the next motivational video, or the next external answer to his internal questions. He had stopped running, stopped proving, stopped trying to be someone in order to feel something. Instead, he was living quietly, fully, and with an inner confidence that didn't need an audience. He began waking up not with anxiety, but with intention. His days weren't packed with noise, but with meaning. He no longer filled every silence. He listened to it. And people noticed, not because he was louder, but because he was different. He walked slower, spoke less, but when he did, people leaned in. Richard's confidence no longer came from knowing the answers, but from being okay with the questions. He had developed something rare. Emotional stillness in a world addicted to stimulation. He started mentoring younger colleagues, not as someone superior, but as someone safe. He showed up for his family not with grand gestures, but with presence. He spent less time online and more time aware. Less time reacting, more time being. And most importantly, he trusted himself. Not because he was perfect, but because he was present. Silence had once felt like loneliness. Now it felt like freedom. The quiet that used to haunt him had become his greatest ally. It taught him that who you become when no one is watching is who you truly are. Richard wasn't just mentally stronger. He was mentally indestructible, not because he was hardened, but because he was grounded. And in a world of noise, distraction, and constant performance, that quiet confidence, that centered, unshakable presence, it made him unstoppable in the most peaceful way imaginable.